It's a stormy day here on the farm, and I was glad to be in the shop continuing to work on the buggy. I'd gotten most of the fork for the front wheel done. I just had a couple brackets I still needed to make for it. The first ones I wanted to work on are the plates that attach the bottom of the fork to the bearings on the wheels. So I measured the bolt holes on the bearings and made a plate that matches. The problem was that the bolt holes are going to be right up against the side of the tubing, and I wouldn't be able to get the bolts through like that. So I decided to notch out a space that'll give the bolt the clearance it needs. I grabbed the plasma cutter and cut out a slot on all four sides. And then I found a piece of square tubing and I cut it in half, and then I tapped it down into the fork. I grabbed the TIG welder and ran a bead all the way around it. And then I cut out a small piece that'll fit in the top, and I welded that in solid. And then I grabbed the grinder with a flap disc to make sure it was all flush and would sit back down on the plate nicely. I thought it ended up being kind of a cool looking shape. I stood it back up on the plates once again and got it into position. I used the calipers to make sure I had the same distance sticking out on both sides. And then I went ahead and tacked it and welded it solid. The next thing I needed to work on were two plates for the two main bearings to attach to. The plates need to be 8 inches wide, and I only had this 6-inch wide. So I was going to have to weld two pieces together to make a plate wide enough that'll cover the bearing. The weld bead will need to be grinded smooth so the bearing can sit on it flat. And so I went ahead and beveled the edges, giving an area for the bead to sit down in. I always like to tack it on the top and bottom, and then a couple tacks in the middle before coming back in and welding the whole thing. And then I grabbed the grinder to grind smooth the seam. I thought about pushing the bearing all the way to one side of this plate, so I only had to trim it once. But in the end I decided to center it on the weld, and I decided it would sit on the plate a little better and probably be a little stronger too, because some of this plates can be hanging off the fork. I used the plasma cutter to cut off the ends. This is the max depth my plasma cutter can go, 3/8 of an inch. So it's kind of a slow go. If you rush it, it just doesn't cut all the way through it. But it still does a pretty good job. And then I cleaned it up with the grinder. After marking the hole locations with the bearing, I center punched them and drilled them out, starting first with a smaller bit and stepping up to the 3/4 inch that I needed. It's really important to get these plates centered on the fork, because if they're crooked, then the whole wheel is going to be crooked. And I was having trouble figuring out how to measure because there weren't any outside corners or inside edges to hook the tape measure on. What I ended up doing was clamping on some pieces of angle on the outside, and this let me measure to the center point, and then from there I could use my square to find the center across the tubing, and I was able to do the same thing on the top. And then I was fairly confident I had a center on the top and bottom. And then I drilled a small hole in these two locations, and after finding a center point on the plates, I drilled a matching hole. And then I used a machine screw that fit in the hole tightly to keep the center of the plate on the center of the fork. This allowed me to spin the plate while maintaining the center point and set it to 45 degrees using my carpenter square. And then I clamped it down really tight. It wasn't perfectly flat after welding the two pieces together, so clamping it down to the frame helped flatten it out. And I repeated the whole process for the top. These front and back bolts are open underneath the plate, and I'll be able to get nuts on them, but the side bolts will have to be tapped into the frame. I had already drilled the hole through the plate. Now that the plate was welded in position, I could drill it the rest of the way through the frame. And then I applied some tapping fluid and used the 3/4 inch tap to put some threads through the plate and the frame. Combining the plate and the frame, I had 5/8 of an inch of metal to put threads into, which is pretty good. The more metal you have, the stronger your threads will be. And then the fork was done. I started in on getting it ready for paint, used the wire brush to clean off any splatter, and then I used some lacquer thinner to remove all the oil. I first gave the bare metal a coat of primer, and then I gave it 3 or 4 top coats of black. And it was time to start in on the buggy. Time to get my hands dirty. First, I decided to pull the radiator, disconnected the hoses, and then I made a big mess when I totally missed the bucket. I should have used the drain plug. I don't quite know what I was thinking there. I think I had a momentary lapse in good judgment. So, I spent the next 20 minutes cleaning that mess up. I'll do that differently next time. And then I disconnected the bolts that held the radiator in place, and I could lower it down and get it out of the way. And then I drained and removed the hydraulic oil tank, and I made a big mess doing this also. I was really going through the floor sweep that day. And then I decided to cut off the front end and get it out of the way, just make things easier to work on. I was going to do it eventually, and thought I might as well do it now and give me easier access to the engine. I'll cut the frame again at the exact location once I know where that is. I use the hoist to raise and lower it and eventually break the cuts loose. I guess no going back on the project now. And then the last thing I wanted to do for the day was to cut out the front engine mount after I jacked up the engine and took the weight off it. Well, now that I got the old front end out of the way, it's time to build a new one. Thanks for watching.